this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll explain how to know if it's time to cross a cable if you've lost count of the number of rows or rounds you've worked since the last crossing. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. I've already done the right crossing cable for this row, and I'm about to the left crossing cable. But before that, I want to point out some things to look at that you see will be different after the cable is crossed. The stitches on the needle right now, every stitch is connected to its neighbor to the right and to the left. And the connection is this running thread between the stitches. So they're harder to see in stockinette fabric because the running thread will lie on the purl side of the fabric. If I pull on this horizontal strand, you'll see that it tightens the two stitches that are on the needle. So this is the running thread between these two stitches. And you'll see that that is solid all the way down here. Like every one of these knit stitches is connected to a purl stitch that's next to it. If I go down a little further though, you'll see that there's kind of this gap. There's a hole I can stick my finger through. It's going to show you when that hole shows up. So I'm going to put those first three stitches on a cable needle, and since these are going to be crossing in front to the left, the needle stays in front. So I'm going to knit the next three stitches. And again, you can see that running thread that's connecting the row that's now 2 rows below the right-hand needle, but it's only 1 row below the left-hand needle because that stitch hasn't been worked yet. But now I need to work the stitches off the cable needle. And now it's time to work this purl stitch. So this is where that hole is created. It's created in the crossing row because the stitch that's under the needle right now, previously it was not next to this column of purls. It was over here in the middle of that those 6 stitches of stockinette. So when you work a crossing row, you get this kind of hole in the fabric. In this cable, I worked my first crossing row, and then 6 rows later, I worked another crossing row, and then I waited 10 rows and did that crossing, waited 6 rows and did 1. So I'm alternating between crossing after 6 rows and crossing after 10 rows. So I did my 6-row crossing here, and I'm not sure how many rows have I worked. I just kind of went back and forth a few times, but I'm not really sure. So what you're looking for is that gap, and you're looking for this running thread right here, and the stitch that it goes into. And that is the stitch that came off the needle when you were working the crossing row. So I need to identify where my last crossing row was. If I'm crossing every 6 rows, that means in every 6 rows there is 1 crossing row. So I count the crossing row, and then the rows that are above it, I do not include the stitches that are on the needle. So I've got the crossing row and 3 stitches above it. So I have 4 rows that I have worked all together, including the crossing row. In my case, I'm working a cable where after the first crossing row, I crossed again after 6 rows, and then I crossed after 10 rows, and then 6 rows. So my next crossing row is going to be when I have 10 rows, including this crossing row worked. So I'll have this crossing row plus 9 others underneath it. So now it's time for me to cross my cable, but I can confirm by, again, looking for where I can stick my finger through, looking for the first running thread that is above this gap, and seeing that it comes into this stitch right here that is angled over here. And I can count, this is my crossing row, and then I worked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rows after that. So I'm going to work this row. This will be a row number 10, the crossing row. And as these stitches come off the needle, they will be the ones that form the new crossing row. So once again, after I've crossed that cable and I connect to the two purl stitches that come after it, that's when that gap is formed. So again, if you are crossing every 6 rows, so you have a crossing row, and let's say that's row number 2, and then you want to cross again 6 rows later, 2 rows plus 6 rows is row 8 of your entire pattern. But the thing to remember is that this row and the rows after that are what equals 6 rows. So you have 5 plain rounds here plus the crossing row. So when you're counting your rows, you've established where your crossing row is, and you're going to count the 5 rows above it. You don't count the stitches on the needle. The stitches on the needle will become the next crossing row. So you can do this regardless of whether you have crossings every 6 rows, or if you have something like mine where I have the first crossing row, then 6 later, and then I had 10 later after that. So what was in this set was a crossing row and 9 rows, so 10 rows altogether, and then the stitches that were on the needle became the next crossing row. If you found this video helpful, you might be interested in my other videos on cabling, which you can find in this playlist right over here. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.